Hi guys, so today we're going to be doing an introduction to behavioral economics. And as you can see, I've listed the specification here for your future reference. But essentially, we're going to be covering why traditional theory assumes people are rational when in reality, consumers often behave irrationally due to biases, rules of thumb, framing, and choice architecture, and how ultimately that affects government policy. So from the outset, traditionalist theory assumes people are perfectly rational and maximize their utility in decision making. We're going to go over a utility theory, but essentially, utility implies consumer satisfaction. So, the traditional thought assumes that they use all information and they make consistent decisions, but there is a critique of this, which is the behavioralist thought, which basically studies how people actually behave. And this matters because irrational behavior can lead to market failure due to overconsumptions, bad financial decisions, undersavings, or even addictions to certain products. So, firstly, they highlight an issue of bounded rationality, which is that people try to make rational decisions, but they are limited due to a time constraint, availability of information, and limited cognitive ability. So this is essentially the framework that the behavioralist critique, which is that consumers gather all the information, they evaluate all the information, and they weigh up the costs and benefits of their decisions. The behavioralists would say that these take too long, and hence consumers they do not make a utility maximizing decision, but they make a utility satisfying decision, which is essentially means that they make a decision that is good enough rather than perfect. So, for example, you could say phone contracts. So most people don't read every detail, so they choose the first option that looks reasonable because comparing every single phone model in the market would take too long. And also, we're going to be talking about heuristics, which links into making a satisfying decision, which is essentially mental shortcuts or rules of thumb. A key aspect of the behavioral theory is the idea of the six cognitive biases that you need to know about, and these are defined as the emotional, psychological, and social factors which influence consumer decision making. And another key term that I haven't included is the idea of bounded self-control, which simply means consumers lacking discipline when making choices. This includes overspending, overeating, binge watching, smoking, or drinking despite knowing the harm, or not saving enough for the future. So, a clear real life example is UK households consistently saving less than economists expect, even when people know retirement incomes may be insufficient. And there's also an idea of availability bias, whereby consumers base their decisions off how many examples they can create in their minds, such as, let's say, some person refuses to go swim in the ocean because of a shark attack that has occurred in the other side of the world. That's a valid example. So, the first cognitive bias is the idea of price anchoring, and this occurs when people rely too heavily on the first piece of information they see, and there's a price imprinted in the mind of consumers. So, for example, if a jumper is priced at £100, then discounted to £60, consumers think £60 is a bargain, even if £60 was the true value all along. Retailers deliberately anchor consumers by showing them inflated original prices. So, the second cognitive bias is linked to the sixth one. So, the idea of social norms influence decisions because people traditionally they follow behavior that is socially accepted. So, a real example is recycling in the UK. So, participation has increased significantly when the councils introduced visible recycling bins because people copy the behavior of their neighbors and want to avoid social disapproval. Another example I've put here is that it is a social norm to tip in restaurants slash cafes. However, you wouldn't really tip your friends at a house dinner. So linked into this is the idea of herding. So essentially, this is following trends, and you can apply this to financial markets. So this is where investors have found a lucrative share or a share with an increasing market value, and this incentivizes other investors to come and buy the share, driving the price up even more and hence resulting in an asset price bubble. And eventually, this bubble will burst and the true value of the asset price will just fall, it will crash. And this, as we've seen, resulted in the 2008 financial crisis and leads to recession. It's very dangerous. And finally, the idea of loss aversion and the endowment effect. So this is the idea that losses feel worse than gains feel good. So consumers experience more pain losing £10 than actually gaining £10. And this explains why people avoid switching bank accounts or energy suppliers even when switching would save them more money. So this is the idea of the endowment effect, that they fear potential losses more than they value potential gains. So Or also, the final cognitive bias is that framing is essentially a choice architectural policy, which we're going to cover on the next slide or two. And this is when the way information is presented changes a decision, even when the facts are identical. And for example, a yogurt labeled 90% fat free is bound to sell better than one that is labeled 10% fat. So the information is the same, but the positive framing makes the product more appealing. This is framing. So here also the idea of heuristics is really important because they are essentially mental shortcuts used to simplify decisions. And examples of these include buying the same brand because it is easier, or even choosing the middle priced option because it seems the safest, or even picking the restaurant with the highest Google ratings without reading reviews. So these shortcuts save time but aren't always rational. As mentioned before, then there are two different types of policies that governments can adopt in resolving a market failure. The first ones that we're going to discuss here are nudge policies, and essentially these are termed as choice architectural policies, and these refer to the way choices are structured and how that influences behavior. So governments essentially use these choice architectural policies to nudge people into better decisions without removing autonomy or personal freedom. So, real life examples include the UK organ donation opt-out system, which massively increased donor rates. So, the idea of default pension enrollments, which increase savings, and supermarkets placing healthy foods at eye level to encourage healthier purchases. So linking back to what a nudge is, so a nudge is a subtle change in the environment that encourages a certain decision. So examples include putting fruit at the front of school canteen lines, displaying calorie counts on menus, adding reminders for tax returns, or printing graphic warnings on cigarette packaging. Or, listed here, salad bars in the middle of restaurants. And as salads are deemed to be a merit good due to their underproduction, this should nudge consumers towards healthier eating habits. Furthermore, nudge policies influence behavior while keeping full consumer freedom, which is what the traditional shove policies do not do. So, mandated choice is when people must make a decision, such as being required to register their organ donation preference, and linked to this, restricted choice limits available options, such as age restrictions on alcohol or banning certain harmful products. Hence, these policies go beyond nudging but still aim to correct irrational behavior and protect social welfare. So, in evaluating the nudge policies or the choice architectural policies, so a main argument is that they can fail if consumers ignore the nudges or if the information is too complex, if people distrust government messaging, if the framing is poor and inadequate, or if the incentives are too weak. So, we as students, we need to know that policymakers need to understand psychology to design effective interventions, essentially. So, as I've listed here, too much government paternalism, so the consumers could see the governments as impeding on their lives too much, and as there is imperfect information of the markets, governments may make a wrong decision, and the benefits of the government intervention into the market to solve the market failure may not outweigh the cost, and this could result in a pure government failure, which we're going to cover later on, but that implies that the costs of government intervention being greater than the benefits. So also a major factor in evaluating it is that the nudge policies assume the people given to psychological fallacies. However, it should be stressed that the consumers can see through behavioral attempts to alter their behavior. In terms, they can read between the lines, and ultimately, it cannot solve deep-rooted issues, or they cannot solve like over consumptions of goods with very price inelastic demand, which is where consumers do not respond to price changes at all due to the addictive nature of their products, such as smoking and alcohol. So, to recap, behavioral economics or the behavioral economic policies, such as the nudge policies or the choice architectural policies, they explain why consumers do not act rationally, such as the concepts like bounded rationality, bounded self-control, loss aversion, social norms, framing, anchoring, and heuristics, they help explain real-world choices. And the nudge policies let governments improve decisions without restricting freedom. However, the issue with the nudge policies or the softer policies is that they are largely untested, they are unpredictable, and they can only change minor market failure, not major market failure such as overproductions and consumptions in demerit goods, such as smoking, alcohol, fizzy drinks, sugary foods. And so, what would be the solution? And I think what AQA wants you to know is that information provision is a good solution or a good policy. So there should be a hybrid shove and nudge policy. So the traditional policies such as taxation, subsidizing, regulation, even the state providing the goods, they have their benefits, such as the price incentives. They are very effective. However, to have an optimal solution that promotes the social interest, they must corroborate it with the nudge policies. So, nudges, we can conclude that the nudges are affect short-term behavioral changes. However, if coupled with the harder shove policies like direct and indirect taxation, they can alter consumers' behavior in the long run.